My wife had cancer. I asked my children for help, but they refused, saying it was your problem. Those words are burned into me like a brand I will never escape. I never imagined the people I had raised, the people I had sacrificed everything for, could look me in the eye, or worse, over the phone, and dismiss the suffering of their own mother as if it were a stranger's burden. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. My wife lay pale and fragile, her strength slowly slipping away as the disease tore through her body. I had spent the past weeks at her side, sleeping in chairs, eating from vending machines, doing everything I could to make her comfortable. But the truth was, I was breaking down myself. I could not do it all alone. So I reached out to the very people who should have stood beside me without question, our children. I called my eldest first. I explained the situation, my voice heavy with exhaustion. I told them I needed help, even something as simple as sitting with their mother for a few hours so I could rest. There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. Then, in a tone that still makes my blood run cold, my own child said, "She's your problem, not mine." I froze. For a moment I thought I must have misheard. I repeated myself, asking again, pleading really, for just a bit of support. But the answer did not change. "It's your problem." The line went dead. I thought maybe it was just one child. Maybe the others would be different. So I called my second, then the youngest. Each conversation ended the same way, each one colder than the last. They had their lives, their careers, their friends, their excuses. None of them had time for their mother, the woman who had raised them through sickness and health, through poverty and sacrifice. They saw her illness as a burden, and me as the caretaker who should shoulder it alone. I remember standing in that empty hospital corridor after the last call, staring at the linoleum floor, my hand still clutching the phone. My chest felt hollow, as though something inside me had broken forever. I had asked for so little, and in return I received rejection so sharp it cut deeper than any knife. That night, as I sat beside my wife's bed and watched her struggle for each breath, their words echoed in my head over and over again. "She's your problem." Those words would become the spark that ignited everything that followed. They thought I was weak. They thought I was helpless. But they had no idea who I really was or what I was capable of once pushed to the edge. I spent my entire life giving everything I had to my family, never once thinking of myself as separate from them, never once holding back when it came to sacrifice. I was the kind of man who believed that a father's duty was to provide, to build, to protect, and so I worked from the crack of dawn until the last light of day just to ensure my children would never feel the hunger and hardship I had known in my own youth. I built our house with my own hands, brick by brick, nail by nail, pouring sweat into the very foundation so that my wife and our children would have a place to call home, a fortress of safety where laughter and love could thrive. I denied myself comforts, working extra shifts at the factory and later taking odd jobs on weekends, because every dollar saved meant shoes on their feet, food on their plates, and eventually tuition fees for their schools. I can still remember those long nights where I sat at the kitchen table, bills spread before me, calculating how much was left after paying for groceries, electricity, and medicine. And no matter how tight things got, I always found a way to give them what they needed. When they wanted new bicycles, I took a second job. When they dreamed of university, I cashed out the small savings I had meant for retirement. I told myself it was worth it, that their futures were brighter because of the sacrifices I made in silence. There were times when my wife and I longed for a simple vacation, a chance to see the world, but we pushed that dream aside because the children needed braces or a better computer or money for extracurricular programs to give them a chance to compete with other kids. I gave up hobbies, friendships, and countless hours of sleep, always telling myself that once the children grew up, once they became independent, I could finally rest. I thought they would see the love and devotion behind every decision, every sacrifice, and I believed, perhaps naively, that when the time came, they would stand beside me just as I had always stood for them. My wife gave everything as well, staying up through the nights when they were sick, cooking meals from scratch even when money was short, teaching them lessons of kindness and responsibility, pouring all her energy into shaping them into decent human beings. Together we weathered storms, economic downturns, family tragedies, always united, always determined to protect the children from the harshest blows of life. And for years I believed we had succeeded. I believed our children would carry forward the values we had instilled, that they would remember the countless invisible sacrifices we made, the birthdays we went without so they could celebrate theirs, the winters we wore old coats so they could have new ones. I believed they would be grateful. I believed they would care. Looking back now, I see how blind I was, how much I wanted to believe in an illusion. Because when the moment of truth came, when my wife's life hung in the balance, all of those years, all of those sacrifices meant nothing to them. It didn't happen all at once, but when I look back with clear eyes, I can see the first cracks in the illusion of gratitude, the subtle signs that my children were slowly drifting from respect to entitlement. I remember the first time my eldest raised their voice at me, not in the playful way a teenager might, but with a sharp edge of disdain that cut deep. They had wanted money for a trip with friends, and when I explained that the budget was tight and that I needed a little more time to make it happen, they rolled their eyes and muttered that I was being selfish. Selfish. After years of working myself to the bone to give them more than I ever had, that was the word they chose. I laughed it off at the time, convincing myself it was just youthful frustration, but the word lingered, haunting me more than I wanted to admit. Then came the middle child, who developed a habit of treating me like an endless bank account rather than a father. Every time they visited home, their words were less about family and more about what I could do for them. Dad, I need money for rent. Dad, I need a new phone. Dad, can you cover this expense until next month? There was never a thank you, never an acknowledgement of the hours I had to work to fulfill those requests, just an expectation that I would provide. Because hadn't I always? And when I would hesitate, even for a moment, they would sigh dramatically, as if my small resistance was some great injustice. The youngest was the most brazen of all. I remember once asking them to help with a repair around the house. Nothing too difficult, just holding a ladder while I fixed the gutter. They scoffed, saying they had better things to do and that I should just hire someone. The words stung, because I wasn't asking for much. Just a small gesture of support, a sign that family meant more than convenience. Instead, I was treated as if my needs were trivial, unworthy of their time. It was in those moments I began to sense a shift in the balance of our relationship, though I tried desperately to ignore it. I told myself they were young, that they would grow out of this selfishness, that one day they would look back and realize everything their mother and I had done for them. But each slight piled onto the next, each dismissive tone and demanding request eroding the trust I had in their character. I would come home exhausted from long shifts, and instead of asking how I was holding up, they would complain that the Wi-Fi was too slow or that we didn't have the newest appliances their friends' families owned. I should have seen it for what it was, the warning signs of a deeper rot, but I was blinded by love, always excusing their behavior, always telling myself that family bonds could not be so easily broken. I see now that I was wrong. The day we received the diagnosis was the day my world shifted from solid ground to endless freefall. The kind of moment you never forget because it carves a scar deep into your soul. The doctor's voice was calm, clinical, but the words he spoke felt like a hammer to the chest. Cancer. My wife, the woman who had stood by me through every storm, the woman who had raised our children with unwavering love and grace, had cancer, and not the kind with easy treatments or optimistic recovery rates, but the kind that came with whispered terms like aggressive and advanced. I remember holding her hand in that sterile white room, my heart pounding, my throat dry, watching her try to smile at me even as tears welled in her eyes, and I felt the floor give way beneath me. From that day forward, life became a blur of hospital visits, endless tests, sleepless nights, and a weight on my shoulders so heavy I thought it might crush me. Every morning I would wake in the stiff chair by her hospital bed, my back aching, my eyes burning from lack of rest, only to face another day of doctors explaining procedures and nurses coming in with bills that stacked higher than my ability to breathe. The cost of medication, the cost of treatment, the cost of life itself, it all felt like a cruel ransom I could barely afford. I sold what I could, cut back on everything, dipped into savings that were supposed to carry us through our old age, because what is money compared to the life of the person you love more than anything? And yet, even as I poured every cent and every ounce of energy into fighting for her, the exhaustion began to gnaw at me, not just physically but emotionally. There were nights I would walk to the hospital bathroom, look at my reflection in the mirror, and barely recognize the hollow-eyed man staring back at me. I would grip the sink and whisper to myself that I had to be strong. I had to keep going, because if I crumbled, who would be there for her? But beneath that determination lay fear, the kind of fear that steals your breath in the quiet hours of the night, when you hear her labored breathing and wonder if it will be her last. The hospital bills piled up on the kitchen counter at home, unopened envelopes that might as well have been bricks, adding to the crushing weight on my chest. Collection notices, reminders, statements with numbers that blurred together into a nightmare of debt, yet none of it mattered to me compared to the sight of her fragile body fighting for survival. I gave up sleep, I gave up comfort, I gave up every shred of normalcy because she was my life, my partner, my everything. But what I needed most was help, the kind of help only family could give. And when I turned to my children for that, when I reached out with shaking hands and a breaking heart, their response would cut deeper than any diagnosis ever could. So I remember the night I finally picked up the phone, hands trembling, eyes stinging from lack of sleep, my voice hoarse from days of speaking in whispers at my wife's bedside. I had resisted calling them for as long as I could, not because I didn't want my children near their mother, but because I believed I could shoulder everything on my own. I told myself that I was strong enough, that my devotion was enough, that the burden of caring for the woman I loved would never break me. But I was wrong. The bills had drained me. The sleepless nights had hollowed me out, and my body was giving up even as my spirit clung desperately to the vow I had made at the altar decades ago, in sickness and in health. That night, as I listened to her struggle to breathe in uneasy sleep, I reached for the phone and told myself it was time. Time for them to step up, Time for them to show that the lessons we had given them, the sacrifices we had made, had not been wasted. I dialed my eldest first. When they answered, I explained, carefully, painfully, that I needed help. Not money, not grand gestures, just help. A few hours a week to sit with their mother so I could rest, maybe a contribution toward the bills if they could manage it, anything to remind me that we were still a family. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope. But then the sigh came, heavy and annoyed, and the words that followed hit harder than any blow I have ever received in my life. She's your problem, not mine. I froze, the phone hot against my ear, my throat tightening as though someone had clamped a fist around it. I asked them to repeat themselves, certain I had misheard, but they only spoke louder, colder. It's not my responsibility. You deal with it. The line went dead a moment later, leaving me staring at the blank screen, the echo of their cruelty ringing in my ears. I told myself the next child would be different. I dialed again, and again I explained, my voice breaking this time, begging for even a little support. Their answer was sharper, laced with irritation. Dad, we all have our own lives. You chose to take care of her. That's on you. Don't drag us into it. My chest tightened, my stomach churned, but still I pressed on, calling the last one, clinging to the hope that at least one of them would understand. But the youngest laughed, an ugly, dismissive laugh, before saying, You've always taken care of everything. Why should this be any different? She's your problem. My hand trembled so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I stared at the hospital wall in disbelief, the pale paint blurring through tears I hadn't realized were falling. My children, the people I had worked and bled for, the people for whom I had given up everything, had turned their backs on us in the cruelest way imaginable. I was left standing in that silent corridor with nothing but the echo of their voices telling me that the love and loyalty I thought was unbreakable had been a lie all along. Those words would not leave me. No matter how much I tried to silence them with reason, no matter how much I told myself that they had spoken out of stress or ignorance, she's your problem, not ours. They echoed in my skull like a drumbeat, relentless, mocking, tearing apart every memory I had once held sacred. I had always believed in family, always believed that blood was thicker than water, that no matter the struggles or arguments or years of distance, when tragedy struck, we would stand shoulder to shoulder. That belief had carried me through sleepless nights, grueling jobs, and sacrifices that had cost me more than I could ever calculate. But those few words, spoken with such callousness, shattered that illusion into shards I could never put back together. I would sit by my wife's bed, her frail hand resting in mine, and still hear them, louder than the machines beeping around us, louder than my own heartbeat. I would pace the hospital corridor at night, gripping my phone as though it might still hold a different answer if I stared at it long enough. But no matter how many times I replayed the conversations in my head, the result was always the same: my children had abandoned us. I had given them everything, and in return, they had given me rejection dressed as cruelty. The betrayal burned through me, not just as anger, but as grief. The kind of grief that feels like losing someone who is still alive. I realized I had not only lost my wife to illness piece by piece, but I had lost the children we had raised, the very people we had poured our lives into, to selfishness and greed. There is a moment when the human spirit reaches its breaking point, when sorrow turns into something harder, colder, sharper, and I felt that shift inside me with a clarity I cannot describe. Something snapped, and the man who had once believed in unconditional family loyalty ceased to exist. In his place stood someone who saw the truth. My children were not the people I had convinced myself they were. They were strangers wearing familiar faces, and they had revealed their true nature in the cruelest possible way. I thought of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every penny earned and spent on their behalf, and suddenly it all felt like a lifetime wasted on people who had no gratitude, no respect, and no love. I clenched my fists until my knuckles went white, feeling a fire build inside me that was no longer grief alone but something else entirely resolved. If they could cast aside their mother in her darkest hour, if they could tell me that her life was my burden and not theirs, then they had forfeited any claim to me, to her, to the family we had once built together. In that moment, as her weak breathing filled the room and their words played again in my head, I swore to myself that they would regret it. The breaking point had come, and from its ashes a new resolve was born. I sat in the dim light of the hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the machines, the only sound breaking the silence, and my mind wandered back over the decades of sacrifice that had brought me here, sacrifices I had once worn as badges of pride, but which now weighed on me like chains. I remembered the years when my eldest was accepted into university, their dream school, the one that cost far more than we could afford. I took out loans in my own name, sold off the small plot of land I had inherited from my father, and worked double shifts until my body ached so badly I could barely stand, all so that they could have an education free from the crushing weight of debt. I told myself it was worth it, that they would succeed, that they would look back one day and say, "My father gave me everything." But now I wonder, did they ever think of that at all, or did they simply see it as their right, something owed to them rather than gifted? I remembered the time my middle child fell deep into debt, foolish decisions and reckless spending burying them under demands from creditors. They came to me, ashamed at first, but quickly turning to expectation, because hadn't I always been the one to fix things? I dipped into the emergency fund my wife and I had guarded so carefully, drained it almost dry, and paid off every cent to keep them from ruin. I told myself that everyone makes mistakes when they're young, that my job as a father was to protect them from consequences too heavy to bear. But I was the one left carrying the weight, and they walked away as though it had never happened, never once repaying me, never once thanking me in more than a passing word. And then there was the youngest, the one who always claimed to feel overlooked, the one I tried so hard to make feel special. I gave them their inheritance early, a portion of what was meant to come after my wife and I were gone, because they said they needed it to start a business, to make something of themselves. I handed it over without hesitation, believing their promises, believing their passion, only to watch the money disappear into poor decisions and a lifestyle that grew more extravagant than their means could support. I told myself it was just a setback, that I had done the right thing, that one day they would rise above it. But now, with their cruel voices still echoing in my head, I wonder if all I did was enable their selfishness. Was it all in vain? Every hour I worked past exhaustion, every dream I set aside for myself and my wife, every sacrifice I made for their futures, was it nothing more than fuel for their entitlement? I gave them pieces of my life, pieces I can never get back, and in return they gave me disdain, rejection, and words so cruel they haunt me still. For the first time in my life, I could no longer avoid the question I had buried deep inside me. Had my sacrifices been for children who never truly valued them, or even me? It was late in the evening when I heard it, a conversation I was never meant to hear, one that twisted the knife of betrayal deeper into wounds that were already bleeding. I had gone to the house briefly to gather some clean clothes and check the mail, leaving my wife resting under the careful watch of the nurses. The house felt hollow when I stepped inside, stripped of warmth, every corner heavy with memories of laughter that seemed so far away now. I was just about to head back out when I heard voices drifting from the living room, low and hurried at first, then rising with unmistakable tones that froze me in place. My children were there, gathered together, and though I had not announced my arrival, I stood quietly in the hallway, unable to move, my ears straining to catch their words. What I heard made my stomach lurch and my hands tremble. "Honestly, I don't know how much longer this is going to drag on," one of them said with a groan. "She's suffering, sure, but it's dragging us all down too. Once she's gone, at least things will be easier." There was a pause, followed by laughter, cruel laughter, the kind that carries no compassion, only self-interest. Another voice chimed in, sharper, greedier. "Easier? It'll be more than easier. Do you realize how much money Dad's sitting on? Between the house, the savings, and whatever's left of Mom's insurance, we'll be set. I just wish it would happen already." My heart pounded in my ears, my breath caught in my throat, and I felt as though the walls themselves had turned hostile, pressing in on me with the weight of their words. They weren't talking about their mother as a person, a woman who had loved and sacrificed for them, but as an obstacle standing between them and money. "Yeah," the youngest said with a smirk in their tone. "It's not like Dad's going to use it for anything after she's gone. He'll probably waste it on hospitals until she finally passes. Better that we get it before he squanders everything." I wanted to storm in, to shout, to demand how they could say such vile things, but my body betrayed me. I stood rooted to the spot, my fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms, my jaw aching as I ground my teeth to keep from making a sound. I listened to my own children plot their inheritance, their words dripping with impatience, greed, and heartlessness, and in that moment, the last remnants of the illusion I had clung to crumbled to dust. They were not just indifferent or selfish, they were predators circling, waiting for death to deliver them what they believed was theirs. When I finally left the house that night, I carried their words with me like poison in my veins, and I knew then with absolute certainty that the people I had loved, raised, and sacrificed for were gone. In their place stood vultures, circling over a woman not yet buried, and they would not stop until they picked me clean as well. As I walked out of that house with their venomous words still ringing in my ears, something inside me shifted, something permanent, something final. The pain that had been consuming me, the raw grief that had left me weak and trembling, hardened into something colder, sharper, unbreakable. I had spent decades being the man who gave without question, the man who sacrificed in silence, the man who believed family bonds were sacred. That man was gone. In his place stood someone who had seen the truth laid bare, someone who understood that the people I had called my children were not innocent victims of selfish impulses, but deliberate, calculating ingrates who saw their own mothers' suffering as nothing more than an inconvenient delay in their plans to inherit. I replayed their words over and over in my head, each repetition fueling the fire that now burned inside me, a fire not of sorrow but of resolve. They thought me weak. They thought me old, broken, and powerless. A man too beaten down by years of sacrifice and grief to ever stand against them. They believed I would carry the burden quietly until the end, leaving them to swoop in and claim everything I had built. How little they knew me. For years I had kept my head down, worked my body to the bone, sacrificed without complaint, but beneath that quiet surface lived a man who knew how to endure, how to fight, and above all how to plan. They had mistaken patience for weakness, love for obligation, sacrifice for servitude. They would learn, and when they did, it would be too late for them to undo the damage they had caused themselves. Standing in the dark, staring up at the house I had built with my own hands, I clenched my fists and made a vow, silent but absolute. They would regret this. Every cruel word, every dismissal, every greedy whisper, they would pay for it in ways they could not yet imagine. I would not shout, I would not plead, I would not lower myself to their level of venom and arrogance. No, I would be methodical, deliberate, as I had been with everything in my life. They had shown me who they were, and now I would show them who I could be. My wife's suffering deserved more than tears and exhaustion. It deserved justice, and though she may never see it, though her fading strength might keep her unaware of what was to come, I would carry out that justice in her name. I would ensure that the legacy we had built together would not be devoured by the ungrateful hands of our children. I would strip them of the entitlement they wore like armor, expose them for what they were, and leave them with nothing but the memory of what they had thrown away. The pain in my chest settled into cold determination, and I knew, with a clarity sharper than any blade, that the path before me was set. They thought they had won. They thought I was broken. But they were wrong, and soon they would know just how wrong they had been. The very next morning, while my wife slept fitfully in her hospital bed and the sun crept through the blinds in pale streaks of light, I made my first move. My children thought I was powerless, that their words had broken me, that I would stumble along until exhaustion finished what cancer had started with their mother. They didn't know that behind my quiet demeanor lived a man who had always handled every detail, every paper, every account with precision. And so I began to gather what I needed, moving silently, methodically, as though preparing for war. I went home and opened the old oak cabinet where I kept the records no one but me ever touched. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I pulled out property deeds, the paperwork for the house I had built with my bare hands, the land title that was still in my name, and I laid them out on the table like pieces of a puzzle. Then came the wills, the original drafts I had foolishly written years ago when I believed my children would one day carry on my legacy with pride and gratitude. Reading the words now filled me with disgust. The thought that they could one day profit from my trust made my stomach churn. Next came the financial accounts, savings and investments I had quietly maintained for decades, accounts they knew little about because I had never boasted or shared details, thinking it was better to surprise them when the time was right. I spread it all out, papers covering the table, documents that represented a lifetime of sweat and sacrifice, and for the first time, I didn't see these things as gifts I would leave behind. I saw them as weapons, as tools I would use to dismantle their greed and make them face the consequences of their betrayal. Once everything was gathered, I placed the stacks neatly into a leather folder, locked it, and slid it under my arm. Then I made an appointment with a lawyer. Walking into that office felt like crossing a threshold, like stepping into a different version of myself. The lawyer was a sharp man with keen eyes, the kind who wasted no time with pleasantries. He asked me what I wanted, and I told him everything. Every betrayal, every cruel word, every greedy whisper I had overheard. I saw no judgment in his eyes, only understanding and perhaps a trace of admiration. Together, we began to craft a new plan. We talked of rewriting wills, of establishing trusts that bypassed my children entirely, of redirecting assets toward charities, loyal relatives, and institutions that would honor my wife's memory instead of trampling it. We discussed safeguards to ensure that no legal maneuver, no manipulation, no trick could undo what I was about to set in motion. As he laid out the possibilities, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. For so long I had been at the mercy of grief, of exhaustion, of my children's cruelty, but now the power was shifting. I was no longer the pleading father, no longer the man they dismissed as weak. I was the architect of their downfall, and I had just drawn the first line of the blueprint. The lawyer introduced me to a financial advisor he trusted, a woman whose reputation was built on precision and an almost ruthless efficiency. When I sat down with the two of them in a quiet office, lined with leather-bound books and the faint smell of polished wood, I laid out everything I owned, every account, every property, every investment, every asset that represented decades of sacrifice and hard labor. They listened closely, asking sharp questions, their pens moving swiftly across notepads as they absorbed the story not just of my finances, but of my betrayal. I told them about my children, about the words that still echoed in my head, about the conversation I had overheard that revealed their greed in its purest, ugliest form. They didn't flinch or doubt me. Instead, they nodded, their expressions sharpening with the understanding of professionals who had seen entitlement like this before, who knew exactly how to dismantle it. Over the next few days, we began the process of restructuring everything, piece by piece. The lawyer drafted a new will, one that made my previous documents look like meaningless scraps of paper. This one had iron walls around it, airtight clauses that redirected my assets away from the greedy hands of my children and toward causes and people who truly deserved them. The financial advisor combed through my accounts with the precision of a surgeon, shifting funds into trusts that were inaccessible to anyone but me, setting up charitable endowments in my wife's name that would endure long after she was gone, and creating legal structures so complex that even if my children hired the best lawyers money could buy, they would find nothing but dead ends. We spoke in detail about each property, each bank account, each potential loophole, and for every possibility, they provided a safeguard. My children believed that once their mother passed, they would swoop in like vultures and pick apart the remains of our life's work. What they didn't know was that every step they took toward that imagined inheritance would instead lead them into a trap of their own making. If they pressed for access, they would be met with documents revealing they had been cut out. If they tried to challenge me, they would discover the law standing firmly in my favor. If they spread their arrogance in public, I would have the evidence of their cruelty ready to expose them for what they truly were. Sitting there with my allies, I realized that I wasn't just protecting my assets, I was reclaiming my power. I had been underestimated for too long, dismissed as an aging man too weary to fight back. But now I had professionals in my corner, skilled, efficient, and utterly unshakable. They became extensions of my resolve, tools of my justice. And as I signed document after document, my hand steady and deliberate, I felt the chains of helplessness fall away. I was no longer the victim of betrayal, I was the executioner of justice, and every line of ink on those papers was a step closer to making my children regret the arrogance that had poisoned their souls. I sat alone in the living room of the house I had built with my own two hands, the silence pressing down on me heavier than any weight I had ever carried. The walls bore the marks of decades of family life, faded photographs of smiling children, scuffs on the floor from when they used to run through the halls, the smell of wood that still lingered from the years I had spent hammering, sawing, and sweating to raise this place from nothing but earth and dreams. I could remember every nail I had driven, every board I had lifted into place, every late night when I worked by the light of a single bulb because I wanted this home to stand strong enough to shelter my wife and our children for generations. This house was more than wood and brick. It was my life's work, a monument to sacrifice, to love, to the belief that what I gave would always be honored by those who received it. Yet now, as I sat in the quiet, those memories felt poisoned. The laughter that once filled these rooms seemed hollow when I remembered how easily they had dismissed their mother's suffering, how greed had replaced gratitude. The walls that had heard bedtime stories and family dinners had also borne witness to whispered conversations about inheritance, to cruel words that dismissed responsibility as though love were a burden. And so, in that moment, the house ceased to be a sanctuary. It became something else entirely. It became the battlefield. Every beam, every tile, every brick I had laid became a reminder of what was at stake. My children believed they would claim this place, believed that once their mother was gone, the house I had built with sweat and blood would fall into their greedy hands. They saw it as their prize, the crown jewel of their imagined inheritance. But they were wrong. This house would not be their reward. It would be their undoing. As I sat there, staring at the walls, I realized that this was where everything would come full circle. The home I had once built to protect them would now stand as the symbol of my justice, the proof that betrayal does not go unpunished. They would come here expecting to take possession, to measure rooms and divide what was never truly theirs, but instead they would find themselves shut out, their names erased from the legacy they thought belonged to them. The house itself seemed to breathe with me as the resolve solidified in my chest. It had been built on love, but now it would serve a new purpose. It would stand as a monument not to their entitlement, but to my resolve, to the strength they had underestimated, to the justice they had never imagined I could wield. As I sat in the home of my own making, I knew I was not just defending it, I was preparing to use it as the weapon that would expose them, humble them, and remind them that everything they had dismissed as weakness was, in truth, the foundation of a strength they could never overcome. Her condition worsened with each passing day, and though I tried to hide the truth from myself, the evidence was written plainly on her face, in the way her once bright eyes dulled with pain, in the way her hands trembled when she tried to lift a cup of water, in the way her breaths grew shallow and labored, even in the quietest hours of the night. I stayed by her side constantly, adjusting pillows, fetching water, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, doing everything I could to ease her suffering, even though I knew that every gesture was only a small comfort against the relentless advance of the disease. She was fragile now, her body weak, but her mind remained sharp, her spirit unbroken. And one evening, as I sat by her bed, she reached for my hand and gripped it with a strength that surprised me. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but every word she spoke cut straight to the core of me. She told me that she knew what our children had said, that she could see the pain etched into my face no matter how hard I tried to mask it, and that she did not need me to pretend. I felt my chest tighten, shame and grief colliding as I admitted to her the cruel words I had heard, the conversations I had overheard, the betrayal that had broken me. She listened in silence, her thumb stroking the back of my hand, and when I finished, she let out a slow breath and told me the one thing I didn't expect to hear. She said, She supported me. She told me not to let them dishonor my sacrifices, not to let their greed consume the legacy we had built together, not to let them trample everything we had fought for. Her voice was fragile, but her words carried the weight of steel. She said she knew I had spent my life working for the family, giving more than any man should ever have to give, and she did not want her memory or my labor to be reduced to scraps for ungrateful children. She said I deserved peace, not humiliation, and that if I was strong enough to endure all those years of sacrifice, I was strong enough to protect what was ours now. Tears burned in my eyes as I listened, because I realized that even in her weakest state, even as her body failed her, she was still guiding me, still giving me the strength I needed. She had always been the wise one, the steady voice that kept me from faltering, and now she was giving me permission, no, urging me to see the truth clearly and to act on it. I promised her then and there that I would not let them win, that I would not allow their cruelty to stain her memory or erase the sacrifices we had made. She smiled faintly, her hand tightening once more around mine, and though her lips trembled with pain, I saw relief in her eyes. She knew I had already begun, and she was telling me to finish. In that moment, with her fragile hand in mine, I swore that no matter how much it cost me, I would carry out her wish. I would not let our children dishonor us any longer. The day I signed the revised will, I felt as though a great weight had finally been lifted from my chest, though in truth it was not freedom I felt, but the cold steadiness of justice setting into place. With the guidance of my lawyer and financial advisor, I crafted a document that erased every trace of the entitlement my children believed was theirs by right. Where once their names had appeared beside generous inheritances, now there was nothing but silence, deliberate omissions that spoke louder than any condemnation I could ever deliver face to face. Instead, the assets that represented decades of labor, sacrifice, and devotion were redirected with purpose and precision. Charities that supported cancer patients, organizations that gave aid to families who struggled as I had struggled, were now named as beneficiaries. A portion was left to loyal relatives who had stood by us without asking for anything in return, people who still understood the meaning of family, people who had shown compassion when my own children showed none. And then there were the professionals, the lawyer and advisor whose competence had become my shield, who now had the authority to carry out my wishes with iron resolve long after I was gone. Not a single line of the document allowed room for manipulation, not a single word left a loophole my children could exploit. The house, the land, the savings, every piece of property that had once been the cornerstone of their imagined fortune was secured beyond their reach. If they tried to contest it, the clauses would bury their efforts under legal stone. If they tried to harass me into submission, they would find only walls they could not climb. This will was more than a legal document. It was my sword and shield, the weapon I would wield in silence until the moment of truth arrived. As I read over the final draft before signing, I could almost hear their voices again, scoffing, dismissing, calling their mother my problem, mocking the idea of responsibility. Those words had wounded me deeply, but now they were also the fuel that drove my pen across the page. With each signature, I cut away another piece of their illusion, until finally there was nothing left for them but the truth of their own choices. They had chosen greed over love, arrogance over loyalty, and in doing so, they had chosen this outcome. I sealed the will, placed it in the care of my lawyer, and sat back in my chair with a steady calm I had not known in months. The battlefield had been prepared, and I had drawn the lines with clarity. They would come, expecting wealth, expecting reward, expecting the fruits of my labor handed to them without effort. Instead, they would find nothing. They would find the cold silence of their names missing from the legacy they thought was guaranteed. And when that moment came, when their faces twisted with shock and rage, I would finally see justice done. The calls began to come more frequently, not with words of comfort or compassion, not with any genuine concern for their mother's suffering, but with thinly veiled impatience that dripped like poison through the receiver. At first, they would ask how she was doing, but their tone gave them away, sharp and hurried, as though the only answer they truly wanted was that the end was near. "How much longer do the doctors think?" one of them asked, their voice flat, clinical, as though speaking about a business deal rather than their dying mother. Another would sigh heavily after I gave an update, muttering about how much money must be pouring into the hospital by now, as if the cost of keeping her alive were an inconvenience to their imagined inheritance. I could hear the irritation growing in their voices with each passing week, the arrogance swelling as they stopped even pretending to hide what they wanted. "Dad, you can't keep spending everything on treatments," the eldest snapped one evening. "You're just throwing money away when we all know how this ends." I gripped the phone so tightly that my knuckles went white, biting back the fury that threatened to spill over, but I said nothing more than a quiet goodbye before ending the call. They thought me silent because I was weak, but my silence was the sharpened edge of patience, biding time until their downfall was complete. Soon the conversation shifted from her health to questions about the house, the savings, the accounts they thought belonged to them. "Have you updated the insurance yet? Do you know what's going to happen with the property when she's gone? We just want to make sure everything is in order." Their words were wrapped in false concern, but the greed beneath them was unmistakable. They were circling like vultures, unable to hide their hunger, and with each word they revealed themselves more fully. They had no idea that the inheritance they lusted after had already slipped through their fingers, that the will had been rewritten, that every asset was now shielded against their grasping hands. And still their arrogance grew. They began to visit less, claiming they were too busy, but they never failed to call for updates. Not once did they offer to sit by their mother's side, to comfort her in her final days. Not once did they ask me how I was holding up, if I needed help, if I had eaten or slept. Their only concern was timing and money, as though my wife's slow fading was an obstacle keeping them from a prize they believed was theirs by right. I listened, I nodded, I gave them only what they wanted to hear, while inside I felt the fire of cold resolve burn hotter with each arrogant demand. They thought they were clever, thought they were hiding their greed beneath polite words, but I had seen the truth in their careless laughter. I had heard their cruelty with my own ears. Every call, every impatient sigh, every slip of greed made the coming moment of reckoning all the sweeter. They were already condemning themselves with every word they spoke. The night she left this world, the silence in the hospital room was deafening. I sat beside her bed, her frail hand in mine, feeling the warmth slowly drain from her skin as the steady rhythm of the machines faltered, then ceased altogether. The nurse whispered condolences, her voice soft, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, a cruel reminder that mine continued while hers did not. For a moment, the world stood still. The woman who had shared my every struggle, my every joy, my every sacrifice was gone, and with her went the last light in a life that had already been dimmed by betrayal. I wept silently, my tears soaking into the sheets by her side, and I whispered promises into the air, promises that she would not be dishonored, that her memory would not be tainted by the greed of those who had abandoned her. I sat there for hours, numb, hollow, broken in a way I cannot describe. Yet even in that moment of unbearable grief, reality intruded with a cruelty that seemed almost unreal. The phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the stillness, and though my hands trembled, I answered, thinking perhaps naively that they had called to grieve with me. Instead, their voices were flat, detached, impatient. "So, is it over?" one asked, the words like a knife twisting into my chest. I swallowed hard, my throat raw, and told them that their mother had passed. There was a pause, long enough to feign sorrow, but shallow enough that I heard the truth beneath it. "That's sad," came the response, but before I could say another word, the tone shifted. "So what happens now? With the house, with the accounts? Do we need to start making arrangements?" My fingers tightened around the phone, rage flaring through the numbness, but I forced myself to remain calm, to keep the mask in place. They thought they were clever, disguising their greed with a thin veil of concern, but I could hear the eagerness beneath their words, the hunger barely restrained. Another chimed in, their voice sharper, bolder. "Dad, you should probably get the will sorted quickly. It'll be easier for everyone if we know what's coming to us." I nearly laughed then, a hollow, bitter laugh that I swallowed before it could escape. My wife's body was still warm, her presence still lingering in the room, and already they were circling, their thoughts not of her life or her memory, but of what they believed they were owed. Their arrogance knew no bounds. I gave them no satisfaction, no glimpse of the storm I was preparing for them. Instead, I ended the calls with curt words, claiming I was too overcome with grief to speak further. And I was grieving more deeply than I had ever imagined possible. But beneath that grief, coiled tight and steady, was the unshakable knowledge that their impatience, their shallowness, their greed would soon be met with the justice they so richly deserved. They had already shown me what they were, and now the time was drawing near to show them who I had become. I called them together under the pretense of discussing arrangements, a family meeting in the house they had once called home, the house they believed was their birthright. They arrived with smug faces, their eyes already scanning the walls, as if calculating what each piece of furniture might fetch, their voices low but hurried as they whispered to each other about what they expected me to say. They thought they were about to step into victory, that I would hand them the keys to everything I had built, that their greed was about to be rewarded. I sat at the head of the table, the very same table where their mother and I had once served them countless meals, and I let the silence stretch long enough to unsettle them. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, almost too quiet, and that quietness forced them to lean in, forced them to listen. I told them I knew. I knew what they had said to me when I had begged for their help. I repeated their words back to them, slowly, carefully, each one hitting like a hammer against stone. "She's your problem, not ours." Their faces shifted, a flicker of unease crossing their eyes before arrogance rushed back in to cover it. But I wasn't finished. I told them I knew more. I told them about the conversation I had overheard, the one where they laughed about how long it was taking for their mother to die, the one where they spoke about her suffering as nothing more than a delay to their payday. Their mouths opened to deny it, but I cut them off, my voice still calm, still deliberate. I described every word, every cruel laugh, every impatient sigh, and I watched as the blood drained from their faces. They shifted in their chairs, suddenly restless, suddenly unsure of themselves. I told them I had carried those words with me every day since, that I had replayed them in my head each time I sat by their mother's bed, and that those words had destroyed the last remnants of illusion I had once held about them. Their arrogance faltered then, but still one of them had the audacity to sneer, to mutter something about me being dramatic, about grief clouding my memory. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on theirs, and for the first time in years I let them see the steel that lay beneath my silence. I told them I was not mistaken, that I had heard every word clearly, and that I would never forget the way they had revealed themselves. I told them their mother had known, too, that even in her weakened state she had seen the truth of their hearts, and that she had given me her blessing to protect what we had built from being devoured by their greed. The room went still then, a heavy, suffocating stillness as my words settled over them like a shroud. They shifted again, their bravado crumbling, because for the first time they realized that I was not the broken man they thought they had defeated. I was their father, yes, but I was also their judge, and the time had come for their reckoning. I let the silence linger, their shifting eyes darting between each other, the air thick with the unease of children who suddenly realized the game was no longer theirs to control. Then, slowly, deliberately, I reached into my folder and pulled out the thick envelope that held the truth of everything I had been working toward. I laid it flat on the table, my fingers resting calmly on its edge, and I told them that the time for pretending was over. I explained that while they had been circling like vultures, waiting for their mother's last breath to signal their inheritance, I had been busy ensuring that not a single cent, not a single stone of this house, not a single drop of sweat from my labor would ever fall into their hands. Their mouths opened in disbelief as I spoke the words they had never imagined they would hear. They had been written out. Every deed, every account, every policy, every piece of property had been redirected. The house they were sitting in would not be theirs. The savings they dreamed of spending would never touch their accounts. The legacy they thought they were owed had been stripped away entirely. Instead, the assets were secured beyond their reach, donated to charities in their mother's name, placed into trusts that supported those in genuine need, and assigned to relatives and professionals who had shown loyalty and respect where they had shown only greed. "You will receive nothing," I said calmly, my voice unwavering, because nothing is what you gave when it mattered most. Their faces twisted, arrogance collapsing into disbelief and then into rage. One slammed their fist on the table, shouting that I couldn't do this, that they were entitled, that it was their right. Another's voice cracked as they accused me of betrayal, as though betrayal had not already been their language long before I ever drew up those papers. The youngest, always the boldest, stood and pointed a trembling finger at me, their voice rising with desperation as they demanded to know how I could abandon them. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at each of them in turn, my eyes steady, and told them the truth they had refused to see, that it was not I who had abandoned them, but they who had abandoned their mother, their family, and me. Their arrogance crumbled then, replaced by the sour stench of fear, because beneath their rage was the dawning realization that their imagined future had vanished before their eyes. They shouted, they pleaded, they threatened, but the will was already signed, sealed, and protected by walls they could never break. All their words bounced uselessly off me, because I had already won. They had nothing left but the ashes of their greed, and I sat there in silence, letting them choke on the bitter truth that their own actions had delivered. Word travels quickly in families, and even quicker in small communities where people pay close attention to what kind of children a man has raised. It didn't take long for the truth to seep out, for relatives and neighbors to learn that my children had been cut from the will, not by some whim of cruelty, but because of the venom they had spat, the greed they had embraced, and the abandonment they had shown to their dying mother. At first, they tried to control the story, painting me as a bitter old man driven mad by grief, but lies have no strength when faced with hard evidence, and I had more than enough of that. The will itself, public once filed, left no room for misinterpretation. The clauses revealed their names missing, replaced by charities, institutions, and relatives who had shown genuine loyalty. And then there were the words they had spoken, the words I repeated calmly to those who asked why, the words that spread like wildfire through our circle of friends and extended family. She's your problem, not ours. People recoiled at the callousness, at the coldness of such a declaration. Their polished images, the proud faces they wore in public, began to crack as whispers followed them everywhere they went. At family gatherings they once dominated, they now found themselves isolated, eyes narrowing as cousins and uncles and aunts turned away from them, shaking their heads in disappointment. Employers who once admired their ambition heard of their cruelty and looked at them differently, respect eroding into disdain. Even their friends, who had enjoyed the lavish nights out paid for with my sacrifices, began to keep their distance, unwilling to be tied to the stain of such ingratitude. They thought they would inherit wealth to elevate their lives, but instead they inherited humiliation that dragged their reputations into the dirt. Meanwhile, those who received from my hand stood proud. The charities established in my wife's name held events where her picture was displayed, her story told as one of love and endurance, her legacy cemented not by ungrateful children, but by lives touched through compassion. Loyal relatives who had supported us in silence were suddenly elevated, their kindness rewarded with stability and recognition. And they did not boast or gloat, but simply expressed gratitude that the sacrifices my wife and I had made were honored properly. The professionals who helped me structure everything stood firm. Their work praised for ensuring justice was not just an idea, but a reality. My children, however, faced consequences more cutting than the absence of money. They were exposed. The mask of dutiful sons and daughters they had worn in public had been ripped away, revealing the greedy ingrates beneath, and once revealed, such faces cannot be hidden again. Everywhere they went, they carried that shame with them, a stain no wealth could ever wash away, a mark that reminded them and everyone else that when their mother needed them most, they had chosen themselves. And that truth, more than anything I could say or do, was the punishment they could never escape. I sat by her grave in the quiet of early morning, the grass still wet with dew, the world hushed as though even the wind refused to disturb the moment. Her name was etched in stone, simple and elegant, a reminder of the woman who had carried me through every hardship, who had given me decades of love, partnership, and sacrifice. My heart ached with the emptiness of her absence, a pain that no justice, no revenge, no earthly act could ever truly erase. Yet beneath that grief lay a strange calm, a sense of finality I had not felt since the diagnosis first shattered our world. Justice had been done. I placed my hand on the cool stone, remembering the last time I held her hand, remembering her faint smile when she urged me not to let our children dishonor all we had built. I whispered to her that I had kept my promise. They had expected to profit from her death, but instead, her name would live on through charities that bore her spirit of kindness, through families who would be helped, through causes that would carry forward the compassion she embodied. The wealth we had scraped together, the house I had built, the accounts I had guarded, all of it was safe now, preserved not as spoils for the ungrateful, but as tools for good. I thought of my children, of their faces twisted in rage when I revealed the will, of the humiliation that followed as the truth spread, and I felt no joy in their downfall. What I felt was vindication. They had chosen their path, and they had been shown the consequences. My life's work, my wife's memory, would not be sullied by their greed. They had taken themselves out of the legacy, not by my hand alone, but by the callous words they had spoken, by the selfishness they had embraced. All I had done was hold up a mirror and let them see what they had become. The cemetery was silent, except for the rustle of leaves, and I closed my eyes, letting the peace of the moment settle over me. I had lost the woman I loved, but I had not lost myself. I had not lost the values we had lived by, the sacrifices we had made, the love we had poured into our lives. Those things remained, carved not only into stone but into the lives of those who would benefit from what we left behind. My children would fade into the background, their arrogance collapsing into nothing more than stories whispered with shame, but her name, our legacy, would endure. I rose slowly, brushing the grass from my knees, and looked at the sky pale with dawn. My heart was broken, but my spirit was steady. Justice had been done. Peace, at last, was mine. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.